Salvete. Greetings, my friends and my neighbors. My name is George Wythe. I'm a lawyer, and it is my distinct honor and privilege to be here with you this afternoon on such an auspicious occasion as this. My friends, my neighbors, before we begin, considering the mood of the day, I think that it would be appropriate that we take a moment to consider the fact that we are able to have such a conversation as we are about to have. And also, not only consider that we are able to have the conversation, but those who gave the ultimate sacrifice that we might do so. I would invite you, my friends, my neighbors, to join me for a moment of reflection before we begin our conversation. Thank you. It is a great pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. Again, my name is George Wythe. I already told you I'm a lawyer. However, I think that we here, not only in Virginia, but perhaps throughout all of America, are in the same place as of right now, in this grand and glorious year of 1782. You see, for the past 7 years, we have been embroiled in a great war for our independence. And with the victory last year at the Battle of Yorktown, where Cornwallis surrendered alongside his 5,000 British and Hessian troops, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And so we stand now here on a precipice, do we not? We stand on a precipice peering out into terra incognita, this unknown land that is the young republic. The question that is on the minds of myself, and I'm certain you the same, is, so what now? How now shall we live? My friends, over the course of my life, I have had the pleasure to serve in a number of stations. I have served as an alderman and as a mayor in the city of Williamsburg. I have served in the House of Burgesses as a representative from Williamsburg and from the College of William and Mary, and also my home county of Elizabeth City. At present, I serve on the Chancery Court of Virginia and as the professor of law and police at the College of William and Mary. I served in the Virginia Conventions, at the Continental Congress, and my name appears upon the Declaration of Independence. I say these things to you, not to offer praise unto myself, non meum laudo, but instead, I say these things to you to offer emphasis upon what I think is the most important role that I have played here in Virginia. That role is the role of an educator. I have, for many years, taken apprentices to the law into my household, and indeed even now, as the chair of law and police over at the college, taken under my wing a number of young gentlemen hoping to study the law. But something that young men studying the law and everyone else has in common is a need for a particular trait. What trait might that be? Well, I think it's very plainly stated by none other than Montesquieu. Montesquieu states that in a tyranny, there's only one man who needs it. In an oligarchy, there's only a few who require it. But in a democracy, everyone must practice it, and that is virtue. And so, my friends, if the question upon your heads is the same as it is upon mine, how now shall we live, that we look into the future and we see a free and independent Virginia on the horizon, what must we do? We must practice and we must instill into the next generation this notion of virtue. A number of years ago, I had an opportunity. It was to see perhaps the most famous person in America, at least at the time. He gave a sermon here at Bruton Parish Church in the year 1739. His name was George Whitefield. And in his sermon, George Whitefield made the point that we desire people to speak on Christ, and yet how might they speak on Christ of whom they have scarcely heard? I think, and I believe you'll agree with me, that we ourselves may very well ask the same of any of our friends and neighbors in regards to virtue. How can we expect our friends, our neighbors, our children in particular, to exhibit virtue of which they have scarcely heard? Of course, it begs the question, I think, what is virtue? As is common the case, I think we might look to the ancients for an example. And if we look to the Romans, we find the word virtue common amongst them. Virtue, in the Roman language, is virtus. It is the name of the god of virtue, which I think might not be particularly helpful in answering our question. But if we look a bit farther, the root of virtue is, or rather virtus, is vir. And I know you've been studying Latin at home. Vir, of course, means man, but it doesn't mean just any man. Homo means man, and can refer to any male who is of age. But vir, for example, is never utilized to refer to a slave. Vir is utilized to refer to those who exhibit what we would call virtues, to use a word in defining itself. Condescension to those beneath their station. Bravery on the battlefield, to be sure, but bravery, you might say, in the domestic sphere. Decency, kindness, charity. Vir, virtus, virtue. My friends and my neighbors, as we peer off into what seems to be a little spot of light, a flickering candle at the end of this dark tunnel of war, it is my hope, it is my prayer, that when we question which way to point the ships, that we will point to virtue. And in doing so, I am convinced we will not only see success in this war, but we will see success and a thriving republic. It is indeed my pleasure now. I wish not to hold the floor over long. After all, you've been so kind to join me, and it's my understanding that a number of you have questions that you should like to put to me, and I am more than pleased to receive them. And so I would like to speak to my colleague who is just over this way here, Dr. Spencer. Dr. Spencer, if you would be so kind, I'm happy to receive the first question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Wythe. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
The pleasure is mine.
I was wondering, sir, you are such a professor of the law that you must have had some very interesting students or apprentices over the years. I was wondering, sir, if you could tell us about some of the people who have apprenticed with you.
Oh, of course, Dr. Spencer, I'd be more than happy to do so. You know, I have no progeny of my own. I have no children. I tend to think about my apprentices and my students as such. I think that many people are familiar with one of my students, at least, as he was the former governor of Virginia. And I mentioned a document that he was rather instrumental in penning some several years ago, the Declaration of Independence. Mr. Jefferson was a student of mine. He came into my house in, I believe it was 1762, and remained for a number of years studying the law and the classics, and also joining together with me and friends to include a professor from the college at the time, William Small, and also the former Lieutenant Governor Francis Fauquier, in what we jovially referred to as a parte quare. Mr. Jefferson was a joy to have as a student. I'm pleased to now refer to him as my friend. But he's not the only young gentleman who's come into my house and darkened my door over the year, if you will. I have a number of others with whom you might be familiar. Again, I say this not to praise myself, but simply to bring note to them. Mr. Tucker, for example, St. George Tucker, who now sits on the courts here in Virginia. There is also Edmund Randolph, James Innes, and indeed, even my superior, Dr. Spencer, if you can believe it, over at the College of William and Mary, Bishop James Madison was a former, I say student, but apprentice of mine the same. Here recently, I've had a number more students have come under my wing. Typically, I would have one in the household at a time, but as I have taken the seat at the college, I now have a number. And one of the more recent ones, who has gained some fame for himself as a delegate in the House of Delegates, is a young gentleman whose name with you might not be familiar, by the name of John Marshall.
Thank you, sir. Scarlett, in particular, asks, how difficult of a student was Thomas Jefferson?
You know, Scarlett, I get this question from time to time. I suppose when someone makes a name for themselves, reaches some level of fame, people want to learn a little bit more detail about them in various facets. And I'll say to you this, and I don't think that Mr. Jefferson would mind me saying so. Early on, I found that Mr. Jefferson was a bit absent-minded. I assigned him, in the early days of his apprenticeship, to read a rather weighty tome, one which has been the bane of law students for a number of years. It was a great difficulty upon me and many others. This would be the works of Sir Edward Coke. You perhaps have heard of Cook's Institutes or Coke upon Littleton. At any rate, in assigning this reading to young Mr. Jefferson, he revealed to me some years later that he was so distracted by the attentions of a young lady whose name I suppose it matters now, does it? It was Rebecca Burrell. Mr. Jefferson was so distracted by by his attention towards young Rebecca Burrell that he told his friend, who is now also a friend of mine by the name of John Page, that he didn't think he would get through Old Cook in all of winter. Fortunately, Mr. Jefferson did eventually make it through Sir Edward Coke. And you know, I will say this, that we all struggle, I think, from time to time in learning in various capacities. However, there have been occasions when Mr. Jefferson has indeed impressed me very much. And I don't I shouldn't say simply, I don't mean at the perhaps obvious times of the Declaration of Independence or otherwise, but in the courtroom and even personally.
Thank you, sir. One last question about Mr. Jefferson as a student. Violet would like to know if you played a role in his life as far as influencing him in the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, thank you, Violet, for the question. You know, I confess to you, I think that there was a time when Mr. Jefferson was growing intellectually and thoughtfully. And I confess this to you because this was a time when I, too, was growing intellectually and thoughtfully. I made mention earlier of the parte quare with myself, Governor Fauquier, and William Small. Professor Small from the college, he has since returned to Britain. We would gather in our parte quare over at the palace at the governor's desire, and it were there where we began to discuss not only things that delighted us, such as music, enjoying Mr. Jefferson's playing upon the violin, but even more weighty topics. You see, Governor Fauquier questioned the institution that is ubiquitous here in Virginia that we call slavery, the keeping of Negro slaves in household, which is so incredibly common here in Virginia that one thinks not twice to walk down the street of Williamsburg and see a black soul or a black person for every two people that you see. That being said, Governor Fauquier questioned it so much that he, in private, revealed to me he wondered if he could get into heaven if he kept slaves. And I will say to you that that greatly affected me, and I cannot help but believe that that greatly affected Mr. Jefferson as well. And in those times, when the four of us were together as friends and perhaps petty scholars, I think we grew the most in our opinions about certain things, to include the institution of keeping slaves, changed.
Well done, sir. Speaking of music, as you mentioned with Mr. Jefferson, Deanna has asked if you play any instruments, and if you do, which one?
Oh, Deanna, that's very kind of you to ask. I am afraid that I am without musical talent. However, I do have within my household a spinet, one that my wife can play quite well. I have over the years come to discover that men and women, I should say, are given gifts. Mine happen to be in the understanding of the law and other what people might consider to be gentlemanly pursuits. But unfortunately, when it comes to music, singing, the playing of an instrument, I am without capability.
Well, that's all right, sir. I'm sure you have many other talents. Pat has asked if you still teach at William and Mary, and how many years have you taught there?
Oh, thank you, Pat. Yes, I do teach still at the College of William and Mary. Here in the year 1782, I have been at the college for almost 4 years. I have the pleasure of knowing that I hold the first chair in North America, and if I am not mistaken, I do believe I hold only the second chair of law and police in a college in the the English-speaking world. The first one being held by none other than William Blackstone, who I am very pleased to say his commentaries on the law are an important and, I've already used the word, but I'll say it again, ubiquitous part of my teachings there.
Speaking of college, sir, Deanna has asked if you attended a college.
Oh, thank you, Deanna, again, for asking. You know, my education is rather typical, I should say, for a lawyer, to be sure. Most lawyers, at least until the establishment of the chair at the college a few years ago, have been apprenticed here in North America, and I were no different. I were born about 20 miles to the east of here at a place called Chesterville. It's along the back river, across the river from a place called Poquoson, if you're familiar with the tidewater here. At any rate, I grew up there next to a place called the Sims Free School, and it were by the hand of my mother that I received a learning in the rudiments of English and arithmetic, and also in the rudiments of the Roman language. Now, I did not learn to read Cicero or Cicero by my mother's hand, but what she did was she gave me an advantage. You know, I sometimes, when I think about my mother, her name was Margaret Walker Wythe. I sometimes, when I think about her, cannot help but remember the woman in the gospel, I believe it's the Gospel of Mark, isn't it? The woman at the temple who has but 2 mites, what we might consider to be 2 farthings. Not much money at all. And although she has only these 2 mites, she is poor. And people note that she only is putting into the treasury of the temple this day that she is there these 2 mites that literally almost no money at all, but it's everything that she can offer. And in doing so, she puts it into the treasury, and our Lord notices her and states that she gave the most of anyone of that day, even though great treasures had been expent into the treasury. Those 2 mites were the greatest gift of all. I think of my mother in the same way. She did not have the library of classical knowledge, but she gave me an advancement in said knowledge. And to continue my story, after I left the apron strings of my mother, I attended for a very brief time here at the grammar school of the College of William and Mary before I were apprenticed to my uncle, a man by the name of Stephen Dewey, near Petersburg. I remained there with him for nearly 4 years, but I confess to you here and now that in those 4 years, unlike my mother, my uncle had a great amount of knowledge to give, and yet I learned very little. It was there that I became little more than an office boy for him. And while I learned a great deal in writing, and my pen certainly improved, my penmanship, I mean to say, I returned here to the city at about the age of 18, not to the city, but back to Chesterville, where I continued to read the law under my own guide for 2 years before I dared approach the bar.
What an interesting story, sir. Violet has asked a follow-up to the question in regard to music.
Indeed.
She asks, what is a spinet?
A spinet is a keyboard instrument. You probably have seen a similar instrument. There, perhaps the most common of the keyboard instruments is a harpsichord. However, there has been in recent years a newer instrument that has made its way across the water. It is known as the pianoforte, or soft and loud. I believe the reason it is referred to as such is because it can play soft and loud. As opposed to a harpsichord that plucks the strings, the pianoforte has a hammer that hits the strings, which allows you to control the volume of the instrument considerably better than a harpsichord. And so it's a small version of these instruments. It is a keyboard instrument, and to be perfectly plain with you, so far as music theory is concerned, I could speak to it very little. I know that it sounds nice when my wife tends to it, and I feel as if from time to time I can sit and plunk out a tune. But when I say plunk, I suppose I mean quite literally.
Mr. Wythe, moving on to a different phase of your life, we've had several questions about your involvement with the Declaration of Independence. And particularly, David has asked, what thoughts and feelings did you have as you signed the Declaration?
David, I appreciate the question. I don't know if you have heard this story or not, but I was not present on July the 2nd of 1776 in the Continental Congress when independence was declared. I wasn't present on July the 4th of 1776 when the Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence as our statement to the broader world explaining our actions here in North America. However, I had made my sentiments well known. I declared in October of 75 that arms would decide whether we would be subject to laws made by men who cared not a fig for us, or whether we would be subject to laws made by men whom we choose and may change. And indeed, I also stated very plainly at one point in the Congress that it was by a courtesy to the Congress that Virginia had not abducted Lord Dunmore and held him. Certainly, it would have been against his will. But there are a number of people, I should say, who are of the mistaken belief that Mr. Henry and I are enemies, political enemies. But while we have disagreed from time to time on our approach to certain matters, allow me to be very plain. On the matter of independence, he and I saw entirely eye to eye. And indeed, I believe that I exhibited his thoughts upon the floor of the Congress, just as he no doubt exhibited my thoughts on the same matter wherever he goes, if you know Mr. Henry. All of that is to say that I actually was on my way back down to Virginia after having spent nearly 300 days in Philadelphia in mid-76, when I heard that I had been re-elected to the Congress. I decided to return here to Williamsburg as I had Elizabeth with me, my wife. I don't think I've mentioned her name yet. At any rate, we returned here to the city, and I did not return to the Congress until September of '76. Now, this was unbeknownst to me, David. However, when I sat at the table, finally to put my pen to paper and sign the Declaration of Independence, I discovered something of which I am entirely unworthy. I discovered that the very worthy delegates from Virginia at this convention, at the Congress, had left room for my name at the top. I am unworthy of such sentiment, and I confess to you that I do not understand their reasoning, but I put my name to the spot, and unlike Lady Macbeth, I have never cursed it.
Thank you, sir. Scott Christley has said, Mr. Wythe, law is necessary for civilized society. He asks, do you feel that all people in society should be held to the same rule of law? With equality under the law, would civilized society cease to exist?
Thank you, Mr. Christley. It's nice to hear from you, sir. I hope that you and your family are well. You know, Mr. Christley, the truth of the matter is that you are correct. That without equal protection and equal rights under the law, society will cease to exist. Let us consider Rome as the example, as we commonly do. The greatest fear in ancient Rome was an uprising of those who were considered to be unequal under the law, by which I mean the slaves. And here in Virginia, we see the same, do we not? In Virginia, the greatest fear is nothing else but an uprising of those whom we hold in bondage. I'll say to you, Mr. Christley, very plainly, as I will to anyone, my time with Governor Fauquier in our party Quarret has quite changed my perspective. And I fully am invested in the notion that John Locke, is correct. That in nature man is born free. That is the natural law. Now, I don't necessarily wish to go too far into the topic. I don't wish to offer a lecture to you here. I am a professor after all. However, I will say to you that, as you may be aware, there are 4 types of law. There is the natural law, the lex naturalis. There is the revealed law, lex scriptura. There is the law of nations, and then there is the municipal law, meaning the local or local governing law. But the superior of all of these is the lex or jus naturalis, the natural law, that which natural philosophers have pursued since time immemorial. It has led us to great discoveries not only about the physical world, but also about the moral nature of the universe. And John Locke has made it plain to us, unlike what Hobbes would have said years before, that man is born in a state of nature is born free. Earlier I spoke on virtue. And I would proclaim to you that virtue points always to the natural law. And when any of the subservient laws are in opposition to the law superior, then it cannot possibly point to virtue. And that is the truth here in Virginia, here and now. There are many here in Virginia who yield first to the most inferior of the laws. That law being the municipal, the local law to Virginia, wherein if you are born to an enslaved mother, then you yourself are enslaved. It stands in stark contrast, to the natural law. And if I, in any other circumstance, would stand in a room or stand in a tavern or stand on a corner of a street and proclaim that man should be born free, and you would cheer and you would shout, then you must agree when I speak in reference to our Negroes the same. So yes, Scott, in brief, I told you I was a professor. But in brief, Mr. Chrisley, you are correct that if we do not receive equal treatment under the law, then indeed society will not function.
Thank you, sir. Deanna has asked, why did you decide to be a patriot, and was there anyone who influenced you to be one?
Thank you, Deanna. That is an excellent question. You know, I myself have, over the years, had to answer the same question even for myself. When did I decide? In the year 1765, the infamous Stamp Act was placed onto the heads of people here in North America. And I confess to you that though I were a proud British subject at the time, I thought that it was important we must adhere to the British Constitution, meaning the government as it was currently constituted. And under that Constitution, we cannot deny the natural rights that are given to British subjects. And one of those rights, one of those natural rights, is that laws must be consented to by the people. With Parliament passing laws in Parliament being comprised of men who did not represent people here in North America, but rather their own interests, we saw the first breaking of that Constitution. The assent to it given by George III made it worse for the wear. Now, of course, after we protested here in North America, the Stamp Act was repealed, and all seemed to be well. Of course, the following day, there was the Declaratory Act, and then eventually we would get to the Townsend duties. That was in '69 when I was the mayor of Williamsburg. And even beyond that, the infamous Tea Act after the repealing of the Townsend duties. All of these being acts that were passed onto the heads of people here in North America without their consent. However, I think if I must pick a singular moment, Deanna, it must have been when we came to discover that by the order of the king's men and the king's commanders within the British Army to fire and murder the people at Lexington and Concord in early '75, it made for a quick, a sharp turn in my own thinking as to the regards of the future of America. And I'll remind you, that was in April of '75. By the end of '75, in October, not even the end of '75, I was calling for independence on the floor of the Continental Congress. I recall saying very plainly that as far as the other colonies, as far as Maryland and Pennsylvania, I cannot answer, but for Virginia, I could.
Thank you, sir. Michelle has asked if you own any slaves.
Michelle, thank you for your question. I understand that it can be a difficult subject to broach, and I appreciate your forwardness, and I will respond to it with candor. The answer is yes, I do. I own a number of people. I, at present, am very pleased to say that the law in Virginia has changed. It is now, and very recently, mind you, this year, it is now possible that if one should wish to emancipate their people in Virginia, they no longer have to go by way of the old process, which was that the slave had to be taken by the master before the governor and his council, and then the governor and the council would have to approve the doing so. Now, a master may free his people as he pleases, most likely by way of his will. Now, I don't need to tell you that I have not yet reached the point in my life where I have drawn a will. However, it is my intention to move in the direction of emancipating the people who are currently legally owned by me. I've not done it yet, and there's a reason for that. The first reason is that a number of the people who are within my household indeed are not my own, but rather they are the property of my wife's family, the Tollivers. I don't have a right to release them, even if I should be desirous to do so. In addition to that, I should say that I hold out hope for the next generation, those who are taking seats inside of the House of Delegates just now and the Senate here in Virginia. My friends, my neighbors, I don't wish for this to be an excuse. It's not my intention for it to be so. But I believe that the installation of virtues into the next generation will begin to reap fruit here in Virginia. And it is my firm belief that the generation upcoming within the government as it currently exists will handle the problem of slavery and will do so with thought and care, not only to those who will lose the financial value, but also to the people themselves who will be finally and justly freed.
Thank you, sir. Speaking of your wife, Aaron has asked if your beautiful wife is still with us.
Oh, thank you, Aaron, for your concern. I know why you ask. My poor Elizabeth has suffered a great deal over the years with an ongoing and lingering illness that has put her to bed and brought her to the brink of death's door. But I am pleased to say here at present that she is happy and she is well, and I look forward when I return home here in just a few minutes to seeing her smiling, perhaps even playing on the spinet.
Thank you, sir. Caitlin has asked about your scientific pursuits, and in particular, if you believe in aliens.
Caitlin, what an interesting question. You know, I have on a number of occasions spoken with people here throughout the city. I'm answering in regards particular to, when you say the word aliens, I assume what you mean is inhabitants of other planets. You know, it is well known, I think, by many, any certainly who pick up journals from the Royal Societies and have the opportunity to read them, various pamphlets, that it is commonly believed amongst the greater minds in the English-speaking and perhaps in all of the European world that there are indeed beings that inhabit other places within the universe. That is to include every possible surface. There are some who believe that there are inhabitants on the moon. There are many who believe there are inhabitants on places like Mars and Jupiter, Saturn. Did you know that there is a gentleman scholar by the name of John Adams, not the same Adams, not the friend of mine who resides up in Massachusetts, but a John Adams from London town who wrote once that he believed there were even inhabitants on the sun. And I'm afraid that I have to agree with these gentlemen, and I'll tell you why. It's because of the prevailing belief, and I hold to it myself, that the great Creator does nothing in vain. And how silly and narcissistic, perhaps even blasphemous would it be for us here on this singular planet, orbiting this singular star, to look up into the sky and think that the Creator could have only and would have only done this for us in particular. I believe it was William Herschel who just last year discovered a planet beyond Saturn. He has called it George's star. And he, I believe, is the one who has stated very plainly, not only does the Creator not do anything in vain, but how silly and how narcissistic would it be for us if we lived on the moon to think that the earth, the sun, and all the other planets and all of their moons were created simply for us. One of my favorite phrasings from a book is from a book called The Plurality of Worlds. I don't know if you've ever read it before. It's from the last century. Many people actually consider this book to be the very first book of our modern enlightened age. And in this book, there is a gentleman philosopher, a natural philosopher, who is walking through a garden with a countess, and they're talking to each other. And he says to her, the philosopher says to the countess, "My dear, did you know that I believe that there are, in fact, people who inhabit the moon?" And she says, "Truly, sir." He says, "Of course. And just as there are people on the earth who worship the moon, I believe there are people who are on the moon and worship the earth. And in fact, we are on our knees to each other." And she says, "Truly, sir." And his response is, again, it's one of my favorite phrasings in all of modern literature. He says, "Of course. Do you believe that we are the only fools in the universe?"
Thank you, sir. Unfortunately, this is our final question for the day.
Oh, what a shame.
Yes, sir. People often credit you as an educator, scholar, and master of the law. And so our final question of the day is, do you have any words of advice for the future generations?
Oh, thank you, Dr. Spencer. I greatly appreciate that. At present, I sit on the Chancery Court of Virginia, and I have had an opportunity to consider a seal for this court, and I have chosen an image from antiquity. Now, this image is commonly known as the skin of Sisamnes. It comes to us from Herodotus' histories. Herodotus wrote a book of histories, or rather a collection of books, I should say, and in the 5th book, he writes of a judge by the name of Sisamnes. Sisamnes is somewhat infamous, I suppose, if you know him, because, as it turns out, the king, Cambyses, this is in Persia, if I'm not mistaken, the king, Cambyses, discovers that Sisamnes, a judge, has taken a bribe for an ill judgment amongst his people. Rather, he has taken money to bring injustice. And the king, Cambyses, is so enraged by this, and I don't wish to put anyone off here, but I think that the lesson is important. He orders that Sisamnes be flayed, meaning his skin removed. And he then takes the skin and stretches it across the judge's seat. He then orders Sisamnes' son, Otanes, to sit in the chair. And indeed, he means that literally and metaphorically. Literally, by the sense that Otanes was the rightful heir to the judge's seat, as it was his father's, and metaphorically, in that he should remember this. The king tells Otanes to never forget how your seat has been cushioned. These words of advice that I offer you are because we are commonly at a comfortable place. We here sit upon a precipice looking out into this terra incognita, this new republic. But we must remember, my friends and my neighbors, that if we have a comfortable chair, that there was a price paid for us to sit in it. In the case of Sisamnes, or rather the case of Otanes, there was corruption. And it was a stark reminder for him that he must be just. In our case, it's quite different. You see, as we sit in our comfortable chair looking out into this brave new world, we have done so by the sacrifice of a number, countless perhaps, men and women who have faced peril in these recent years. And indeed, if we wish to do them justice, then we ourselves must seek justice We must point our ships towards virtue at all times. We must not only practice it ourselves, but indeed we must instill it into the next generation so that no one may say to us what Reverend Whitefield said in 1739. How could we expect our children to speak on and act upon virtue of which they have scarcely heard, but indeed that we might not only see them succeed, but thrive? My friends, my neighbors, I cherish our time here together. And it is my sincere hope that soon enough we will be able to sit in my parlor and have conversations such as these face to face. Until then, I wish you well. And as the Romans would say, valete. Be well. And we will see you again soon.